All right. Does it make sense if I say to you, in order to completely understand contracts or the creation of contracts, you would have to completely understand agency? Does that make sense? I think it's going to make sense when I show you some things today. So agency is just one of those things you've got to make sure you know. It's going to affect how we work in the real estate business, for one thing. It's going to affect, when you have a test question, when did this offer turn into a contract? So you're going to have to understand that, and it will help if you understand how agency works. So I'm on Unit 9, which is page 258. And so looking at your exam outline, you've got 13 questions from Unit 9 and 10 that's in this national portion of your exam. You've got 13 questions in Unit 7 and 8 on your national part of the exam. Now, in the state section, you do have some questions in those units also. On 7 and 8, in the state portion of your test, you've got 8 questions under 7 and 8. So that's 21 questions, everybody, under 7 and 8. And you've got 3 in the state section under 9 and 10. So that gives you about 16 under 9 and 10. So that's a whole bunch of your final on 4 units. So does everybody follow me? These are, even though there are sections that are maybe level 1 or 2, I would treat these 4 units as if they're all level 3, to be real honest with you. And I know, because I go back and read along with you, I know units 7 and 8 are really long units to read, but I would take time to maybe go back and read some of the parts, and maybe even just doing a little bit at a time, because it's that important. I'm going to ask you before Wednesday to read over, if you'll go with me just for a moment, to page 274. I'm going to ask you before Wednesday to read the offer to purchase. If you read over this offer, now it probably would help if you read Unit 10 first, but if you read over these, well, there are 13 pages. If you read this offer to purchase, all the provisions here, I'm telling you, I can think of maybe 5 test questions that are pulled from the offer to purchase. Now, they're not going to say, what does provision 11 mean? It could be a question, does death terminate a contract? And we're going to see within this form exactly where it says it does not. So if you read over the offer to purchase form, and I'm going to remind you several times, you really need to. But getting a preliminary look at it before we have our discussion Wednesday, I think will help you. So, but we're going to be getting there. So on page 258 and 259, we're going to begin talking about the basic contract law. I would look at the definition of a contract. So on page 259, take a moment. Now I know you guys have read, that's the presumption anyways. I want you to look at your second paragraph where you see the definition of a contract. Take a moment and read that again, please. see the word enforceable, look at the first couple of words. A contract is a legally enforceable promise. The only way it can be enforceable, everybody, is if it's in writing. Does that make sense? In fact, when you see a test question, if it references according to the statute of frauds, it means it needs to be in writing to be enforceable. Everybody with me? We cannot enforce oral agreements. We cannot enforce oral contracts or oral agency. Which agency agreement can be oral?
The buyer.
Buyer. Indefinitely?
No.
Okay. Intended to be temporary. And it must be in writing eventually, right? And so all of your agency agreements must be in writing, but I want you to remember or think about it for a moment. Those agreements have to be in writing because it's license law. Sales contracts and deeds and documents that are conveying interest in real estate, they have to be in writing because of the law. It's called the statute of frauds. Everybody good? All right. Are you sure? We don't put our listing agreement because the statute of frauds says to. We put our listing agreement in writing because the real estate commission says to. License law. Okay. All right. So enforceable, promise or set a promise, legally competent parties, lawfulness, competent parties. What would make a person competent?
Age.
Age. Age would be one. You have to be the age of majority, which is 18. Competent, maybe not drunk, maybe not insane, maybe not, competent.
Yeah.
If you can't read, are you incompetent?
No.
No. You can't write?
Nope.
No. All righty. Next thing, supported by legal consideration. Let's write this down, and it is in your reading, but let's go ahead and write it here, and then we'll revisit. Consideration by definition means value. Consideration is value. I think about consideration as the glue that holds it together. What are we negotiating? Consideration can be money, doesn't have to be. Can be action, can be a promise. Can't you barter with people and there's no money involved? You're exchanging the action. You know, if you'll do this for me, I'll do that for you. So it doesn't have to be money. It can be action, it can be a promise. In your deed, when you learn the essential elements there, it could be love and affection in your deed, because can't you grant a deed or title or ownership to someone else and just give it to them as a gift? No money on it at all, and love and affection is valuable in that case. All righty. Then it says to do an act or refrain from, legal act, where there is where the law says there's a remedy if there is a breach. So let's talk about those words. Remedy means a solution. Remedy means recourse. Remedy means a legal solution if somebody breaches. A breach means you broke the contract, you broke your promise. So if someone breaks the contract, the injured party needs to have recourse. So that's what remedy means. What is the legal recourse? And if you read over your sales contract, and we'll discuss it too, the recourse is written in the contract. So let me just mention that to you now. It's a little premature, but let's talk about it as we go. If the buyer breaches a sales contract, meaning they are in this contract, the seller agreed to the terms, the buyer offered, we are in the contract. If the seller breaches or says, buyer, that's what I'm saying. If the buyer breaches, that means they break the contract. The seller's recourse, and the only recourse, is to keep their earnest money deposit. That's the only thing the seller can do if the buyer breaches and if we're using the standard offer to purchase Form 2T. What do y'all think about that? The only thing the seller gets is the earnest money deposit according to the Realtor Standard Offer to Purchase Form 2T. All right, let's think about what if the seller breaches. If the seller breaches this contract between the seller and the buyer has a lot of remedy. The buyer can sue for compensatory damage, money. The buyer can sue for liquidated damage, give me back my earnest money. The buyer can sue for consequential damage, which we want you punished, right? Punitive. The buyer can sue for specific performance. Didn't we talk about that in Unit 1 maybe? Sell me this property. And they can sue to just cancel the contract. It's called rescission. So I'm going to show you where that is in the book. But so tell me what you're thinking. The buyer has all that recourse. The seller does not, according to the standard offer to purchase form 2T that most realtors use. So what are your thoughts on that?
Makes sense to me.
It makes sense to you.
So he gets to keep his house. Yeah, that's the most important thing.
Right, you can sell it anytime.
Huh?
You can sell the house anytime.
Yes, sell another time.
It feels lopsided to me, but they're smarter than I am because they said, but the seller gets to keep the house. And that's the way the courts see it. The courts say, seller, what have you lost? The buyer breached the contract. Yeah, you might have lost that buyer, but you still have the property that is unique and you can go sell. I got cold chills. Why did I get cold chills? Because y'all are so smart. That's why. Because the seller still has that unique property that they can go sell to someone else. Remember we said in North Carolina that the law tends to favor the buyer on that? And not that it would never be ruled the other way, but the courts look at it the way these ladies said. All three of those smart ladies over there. Good job. All righty.
Quick question. What's the term for buyer beware that you use?
Caveat emptor.
Thank you.
Jose said, what's the term for buyer beware? It's caveat, C-A-V-E-A-T, emptor,
Thank you.
E-M-P-T-O-R. All righty, let's go, if you will, to page 261. I'm going to come back, so don't fret over that, but let's go to 261 and talk about these a little more detailed. So the essential elements of a valid contract. If you have a test question, and the question asks you, if a closing date is left off of the contract, is the contract void? Do we need a closing date?
No.
No. If it said, well, that's just a good one right there. If the closing date is left off the contract, is it void? Guys, it's hugely practical and reasonable to have a closing date, but couldn't you have something there to be determined later? We're contracting with a contractor and they don't want to lock in a particular day because then the buyer's going to hold them to that day. So missing a closing date does not render the contract void. Guys, my whole point to you, 4 things we need. We've got 13 pages. We got a bunch of other stuff that we don't need, but it's hugely practical that everything be discussed. And a whole lot that's on that offer to purchase Form 2T is by commission rule. The commission has a rule, and it's in your unit maybe 10. There's a rule that says, we don't care what form you use. I'm paraphrasing. The commission doesn't care what sales contract forms we use. They don't tell us to use this form. Whatever form you use, you need to address certain things that the commission says needs to be addressed. And so we have a 13-page contract. Basically, 4 things need to make a contract valid. Kind of like when you go back in memory to the things that make a deed valid. Does a deed have to be recorded to be valid?
No.
Why do we record?
To give notice.
To give notice to third parties. You're recording to protect the party, so it would be the grantee, the buyer now, the owner now. You're recording to protect them. You're telling the world. Why don't you write this down? We're also recording to close the transaction.
Get our commission.
Get your commission. We don't get paid until it's done. And so we record also to close the transaction. Everybody, that's in your sales contract. So I hope you're getting my point. A lot of things we talk about will be addressed in the sales contract. And if you read it in that context, I think it'll help you with your exam. All right, so look at the bottom of 261. Legally competent parties. Mentally, sufficient mentally capacity. Well, now, is it your job to determine if somebody's got mental capacity? I think it's above my pay grade, really. But like Jose said, if I know my seller and I go out to present an offer tonight and I can tell that they've been imbibing and they're slurring their words a little tiny bit, I'm not determining their capacity, but I am going to suggest that we look at this tomorrow instead of tonight. I mean, because if they are intoxicated, your reading said they could call you up tomorrow morning after they signed it and they could say, hey, I'm looking at this. I didn't know that was there. I don't like that. It could be voidable. They could avoid that because of being intoxicated. So we're not going to determine mental capacity, but you do need to be aware of how people are acting. So we talked about 18. Look at your, go down to about the 4th or the 5th line. Generally, minors' contracts are voidable. Do you see that? I'm on the bottom of page 261. Well, I thought you had to be competent to get into a contract. It doesn't say it's void. Void means it doesn't work, right? It doesn't meet the terms. Minors, it says it's voidable. Tell me, give me some thoughts on that.
I mean, they can go into a contract, you just can't enforce it.
Technically, you're right. But I'm going to say technically they shouldn't enter into a contract. Technically. What she's saying, I think, or let me elaborate. How many of us ask to see the driver's license of everybody, of the buyers that we're working with? Guys, young people look a little bit more mature and older, I think. Or some people, you might not know their age. Might be a good idea to check someone's driver's license, number one, for safety, if you don't know that person, but number two, to look at their age. If we don't, and they enter into the contract, like she said, they enter into the contract, it could go through. If they don't say, I want out because I was underage, it could go through. And I suspect contracts have happened that way. But if you're looking at their driver's license and see that they're underage, you shouldn't write the offer, of course. Does that make sense? Because they're not competent age-wise. But it could, if it does happens, they could come back and avoid the contract. That's what voidable means. What does the word able at the end of the word mean?
Capable.
Capable. Can be. So voidable can be avoided by the party that doesn't meet, or it could not, or they could stay in. So voidable means it could be, can be. Go back in your mind to Unit 3 when we talked about real estate taxes. Beg your pardon, my mind went somewhere else. My mind went to Unit 19. Ugh. We'll talk about that later. We're not there yet. I was there yesterday in my weekend class, but we're not there today. I beg your pardon. When we talk about capital gains, we're going to use the word taxable. That's what I was thinking, but we'll talk about that later. All righty then. So someone can avoid it if they are mentally incompetent. Let me give you an example. I had a student years ago. He was taking a broker class or a continuing ed class. He's a real estate broker and he did a lot of commercial real estate. He gets a call one day from an elderly woman, and we're going to be careful how we say elderly. And so he got a call from an elderly woman, and she says, I would like for you to come talk to me about putting some land on the market that I own. And land, not the easiest thing to sell, but the land was near an interstate highway, which could be good. That could be a good listing, couldn't it? So a lot of land near an interstate highway. And so he went out to meet her, and she listed the property with this person. And so got it listed, signed the listing agreement, and so he got hired to go look for a ready, willing, and able buyer. Next day or two, he gets a call from her daughter. I understand that you listed my mother's land. My mother has Alzheimer's, and we want out of that agreement. She was competent then, you're telling me, right? Well, the agent says she was competent. She knew what she was doing. And the daughter says, but she's not competent all the time. She has Alzheimer's. We want out of that listing agreement. What do you think the broker, my student, did?
You have to get out.
You should have said, okay,
We will what?
we will cancel the listing is what he should have said.
Well, here's what he said. Doesn't sound, it might not sound right to you, but we're in a business, right? He said, I hear you. I would like proof of that. I would like for you to send me something that I can put in my file. Can't we always say my broker in charge will kill me if I don't put that in my file? I can't just let contracts.
Wouldn't he also need to hear it from her, like not the daughter? Wouldn't he need to legally hear it from her mouth?
That's an interesting point Kristen's bringing up, because I'm suspicious. She might be saying, Mama, are you crazy? That's my inheritance, right? But he said, I want some documentation of that. And on the letterhead,
Provides documentation.
doctors do provide
I said
documentation.
even if, okay, so
Oh.
even if she does provide documentation of that, can the mother still say, I just, because that says I have Alzheimer's, I legally still want to do this?
Good question for a lawyer. But it feels like she could.
Yeah.
It feels like somebody's coming in who's upset, but they could be coming in protecting her too. So you never know, do you? But he said, and I remember when he said it, my thought was, ugh, you didn't just let her out? But when you think about it, guys, we're in business.
Yeah, but I still, you let her out and then you hope you get that listing because you've made the goodwill with the heirs after she does pass away.
I'm just gonna say it's business.
Yeah.
Most of us would probably do what Libba says. But guys, commercial real estate, it doesn't really matter. It could be a listing you got, and somebody's just thinking, well, I want out now. Could be a renter that signs a lease and they call you up, I want out now. Guys, these are contracts. And it isn't one-sided. They're not unilateral. And I know our hearts go out, but it's business and you signed a contract. Hey, maybe I could say another way. It's not up to you. That sounds bad. Who's it up to? Your company. It's up to your BIC, isn't it? It's not your decision. So if somebody called you up like that, you would go to your BIC. You would say, I need to get back with you. I need to talk to my manager or my broker in charge about this. Okay, let's move along. Go with me over to 262. Is it hot in here, or am I just getting worked up? I'm worked up. All righty, page 262. Let's just go to number 3 first. I want to save the mutual agreement for last, because that's where I really want to spend some time. Number 3 is legality of object. So in other words, the contractual intention and the content needs to be legal and lawful. That makes sense, doesn't it? Can't be something that would be against the law. Number 4, consideration. Now, I've got them in a different order, and it doesn't really matter, but consideration is something bargained for, something of value. And I mentioned to you, most times it probably is money. Most times it's money. So on a sales contract, most times the consideration is the sales price. On a rental agreement, most times it's the rent. So here's what I want you to write in your notes. Earnest money deposit, security deposit would never be consideration. Earnest money deposit, security deposit would never be consideration. In other words, that's not the value of the negotiation. And what does the word deposit mean? You get it back. I'm putting down a deposit, I get it back. Well, we're going to learn in Unit 21, I believe is the closing unit, we're going to learn that getting it back means a credit when we go to a closing meeting, but a deposit means we get it back if we meet the terms of the contract. So usually sales price, usually rent would be the consideration. Anybody have any questions on that? Look at your last sentence on number 4, consideration. A binder, we call earnest money deposit. It really is showing good faith. It's showing that the party is earnestly making this offer. So if you were asked, is earnest money an essential element to make a contract valid, the answer would be no. Now, what did I say a few minutes ago, though? I said earnest money deposit is the only thing that the seller would get if the buyer were to breach the contract. So as a listing agent, it would be real important to encourage the seller to make sure they've got enough earnest money deposit with this offer. Guys, we're going to talk about financing later in the week and next week. There are loans that are 100% loans, VA loans, for example. And 100% loans, a veteran may be borrowing that money because that's a benefit he has, but it also could be he doesn't have any other money, right? No cash. So there are some loans that the buyer may not legitimately give earnest money deposit. So, there would be times that we would explain there's no money here, but we also need to explain if they breach, you don't get anything, right? Yeah, the lady said you still got your house, but there is time and trouble and other things. We don't want people just breaking a contract, do we? Without any kind of remedy.
Especially if it's the first offer kind of thing, you don't want to be like, hey, not yet.
You know what, that's a good point. We said the first offer tends to be the best offer. If you take that offer and the property is off the market, it's called under contract. Most agents I'm finding don't show houses that are under contract. And my question is, why not? Is my question. Isn't there a backup contract addendum we got? I'm just saying, why not? Why don't you show it? I get why not on one perspective. Why not? Because if my buyer gets all excited and gets in a backup position, what are the odds that they're going to get that property? Well, the odds could be good because we got due diligence now. If you read your reading, we've got due diligence. And buyers do walk away from contracts. But I get Jose's point. What?
Is that common to
What?
be under contract and walk away a lot?
Under due diligence, sure. Due diligence means the buyer can walk away for any reason they want. There's a time period in the sales contract that says, do all your investigation, inspections, and get your loan. And if you can't get your loan, you need to walk away if you need a loan. If you find inspections or repairs that need to be done you don't like, you can walk away. So I'm going to say it probably is fairly common because it is a buyer's right to do that. I'm not saying it's an everyday thing, but buyers do. It is a right they have to terminate.
In that period, that's when you would, if you walked away, that's when you would lose your earnest money.
No, you would not lose your earnest money. You would lose due diligence fees. So we're kind of hold that thought. Kristen, I know what she's at. Kristen knows what she's asking. and I want to put her on hold for a minute. Go ahead.
Oh, so if you were to show a house after it's already under contract, would you let those people who are coming to see it know, like, there's a good chance that you might not get this house?
You would have to. It's a material fact.
Yeah.
You would have to. Because if you are a member of MLS, when a property goes under contract, it has to be put in MLS. Now, guys, I'm not trying, these are just my opinion things. I get it when people say we don't want it shown anymore. Sellers sometimes say that. I've had the house on the market for a long time. I'm tired of cleaning up and making sure the beds are made and getting everybody out of the house. If we're under contract, I don't want it shown anymore. But to me, it just feels like why not? I mean, for a little bit longer, just to make sure this contract's gonna be good. So that's just my opinion. And it's coming from, I just taught a broker class, a contract class, and we had a lot of discussion about that. And so that's more real life stuff, instead of, this class stuff. Anyways, earnest money is not a requirement was what I was getting to. Comments, questions? Uh-huh.
Was the earnest money, determined? Is that something that's, in other words, negotiable, or I didn't know?
Good question. Question is, how is earnest money determined? It's negotiable between the buyer and the seller, but we gotta start somewhere. So the real estate agent writing the offer is gonna give the buyer some guidance on that. A lot of it depends on how much the house is. If it's a real expensive house, you expect more money. It depends on what kind of loan they have. If you've got a buyer putting down 20 or 25%, why couldn't they give a little more money? It's good faith and they're gonna get it back. It's showing we are entering this in good faith. And so the only time the buyers lose their earnest money, everybody, is if they breach. That's the only time. It could be the marketplace we're in now. It's a seller's market. Houses are selling just like this. And a seller probably says, if I'm taking your offer, like Jose said, I want some good earnest money. Things like that. So the financing. If somebody's getting an FHA loan or a VA loan, oftentimes they don't have a lot of money. Doesn't mean always. And so you would have to take that in consideration. Seller, here's why they didn't give earnest money. They're getting this high of a loan. So it all depends. You'll kind of get a rhythm of it when you're in the business, and agents will tell you for that price point, you ought to get maybe around $2,000 or so. I mean, you'll kind of get a rhythm, but there's no formula for it. Yeah. Okay. All righty. Everybody go with me to page 262, and I would love for you to read number 2. Now, I do know that you've read. I just feel like when I ask you to reread a particular part, maybe there's a reason for it. And so it wouldn't hurt to read it again. Lawful.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
It says lawful. Legal, you could write down legal or lawful. All right, everybody, this is major. When I said to you that you need to know agency, this is why. So when we look at mutual or deliberate agreement, we must have this meeting of the minds. And I want you to look at the last, probably the last sentence. Furthermore, the acceptance must be actually communicated, major, to the offeror. The methods, we'll talk about those methods of communication. But that sentence, the acceptance must be actually communicated to the offeror. Now here's what I want you to write in your notes. To the offeror or their agent, to the offeror or their agent, if they have one. The acceptance must be actually communicated to the offeror. The offeror is the person who gave it, and so that might be the buyer at the beginning. Everybody with me? Or their agent if they have one. All right, who does not have an agent?
For somebody on
Okay, who does not have an agent?
it. Customer?
Customer. Buyers who elect to remain customers do not have an agent, and you all who said for sale by owner, that's true too. Because that seller has decided I don't want to list, so they would be a customer if you came along and wanted to show their property to a buyer client. So guys, customers don't have an agent. So they don't have somebody advising them and negotiating. Now, I am not saying this. This is agency, everybody. I am not saying that the buyer's filling in the blanks on his offer or coming up with something and giving it to you and you're giving it to the seller. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that customers do not get advice. The seller's agent will write the offer on behalf of the buyer customer, looking out for the seller. If a buyer wants to be a customer, you still show houses to them, you still give service because you're looking out for the seller. And if you're a seller's sub-agent, then aren't you looking out for the best for them? Don't you want to be of service to this buyer and get them to write an offer and do all of that? So buyer customers use the assistance of the seller sub-agent. So they're not just out there floating around on their own, but you have to know who's who in a transaction. So let me show you a couple of things. Look on page 263 and read your third paragraph. And I just want to remind you, as we go through the course, we are going to see license rule, license law throughout every unit almost. When we get to close to the end of the lecture, when we're speaking of Appendix A, I'm reminding you that we would have already learned almost everything by the time we get there. So when you see paragraphs and there's a rule there, it's probably mentioned in your Appendix A. So I don't want you to think on your reading schedule, we're going to learn something brand new 2 days before the exam. There might be one or few little things, but most of it we've already learned. Well, we will have already learned. Does everybody remember that? And here's a license rule, so take a moment and read that. Last 3 lines is really my whole point. Remember that as an agent of a client, because that's when you're an agent to them, a real estate broker stands in the shoes of the principal. Principal means client. You stand in the shoes of your client when we're speaking about communication. And communication of acceptance or revocation to the agent of the client is the same as communicating to the client. When you see the term execution, it means the signing of. That's what that means in that context. All right, let me show you a couple of more things. Just hold your place and go with me over to page 299. Now everyone, to me, Unit 9 is about 9 pages. Unit 10 is about 20, so they're not very long units. There is good discussion, we're going to spend time on it. These units, in my humble opinion, could have been 1 unit. So when I teach Unit 9, I also incorporate Unit 10 together because it goes together. So for example, on 299, look at the bottom, the offer and the acceptance. Look at the last second line on down. To form a valid real estate contract, there must be an offer. And there must be acceptance of that offer. And communication of the acceptance to the other party. Write in your notes right there, or their agent if they have one. at the bottom of page 299. The communication of the acceptance to the other party, we call offer or their agent if they have one.
So I guess that's why you should, as soon as they call you, you better call the customer. So they don't call you and say, I don't want it, ooh, too late.
That's right. That's right. It's kind of like who speaks first wins. So when I answer my call, I'm going to say sold. That's my greeting. It's sold. It's sold. Oh, but I want to withdraw. It's sold. All righty. Go with me over to page 300 and look at the paragraph entitled The Acceptance. And glance at that for a minute. Guys, I know I'm asking you to read a lot, but I just think you ought to right now. So just take a few minutes and look at that paragraph, the acceptance. All right, look at your third line down. And acceptance occurs when the offeree. So at the beginning, the buyer, the would-be buyer would be the person making the offer. They would be called the offeror. The receiver, now this EEOR was in your Unit 5, wasn't it? The receiver would be the offeree, and that would be the seller at the beginning. The offeree, the acceptance occurs when the offeree signs the offer without making any changes. It has to be a mirror image. In other words, the offer is presented to the owner, and the seller says, I love it, I like it, I'm taking it, and they sign it. That's called acceptance. If they say, I love everything but I want a little more earnest money, that would be a change, wouldn't it? And we call that a counter offer. Any change to the terms that come in would be called a counter offer. And it's important for you to remember, a counter offer is a rejection. It's a rejection. Now, that's important for this reason. Having been in the real estate business, and Libba might can attest to this too, having been in the real estate business, when offers are presented and there are counters, yes, we're negotiating, that's true. Buyers particularly don't understand exactly what that means. I'm generalizing, but it feels like they don't understand exactly. My feeling was they think that they're okay while they're negotiating. They sort of think that while they're negotiating, nobody else can come in and make an offer. And that's not true. While we're negotiating, because your offer was rejected, right? Somebody else who looked at that house too can come in and make an offer, and we have to present all offers, even if we're negotiating, and the seller can say, wow, hold the horses, I'm taking this one. So guys, I do think buyers need to understand, and it feels like it's the buyers to me, and I am generalizing on this. They really think things are held up until we negotiate this out, and it isn't. So you need to make sure, in a market particularly like this one, you need to make your best offer because other people are looking and all other offers will come in. Okay? I heard, and I was little, at first when I heard this, I thought, we were watching Property Brothers on HGTV, and the young brother who does the real estate showing, he found a house for these people and they made an offer. And so it was at the reveal, and he's telling them about the offer that they made. And here's what he said. He said, your offer was rejected. Now, here's what went through my mind first, because I've been in real estate forever. They didn't even counter. They rejected it. And then he said, here's their counter. He says, they will take this instead of that. And I thought, bravo. Is it on the Bravo channel? I thought, bravo, because literally it was rejected, right? And that is a good frame of mind to put them in. Your offer was rejected. They came back and said they'll take this, they're willing to negotiate. So after it all kind of panned out, I thought, you know what? That's an excellent way to say it, because then that lets them know that
It's not over.
well, it might not be over, well, it would be if it was a complete rejection maybe, but it's letting them know it isn't held up until you decide, or until we work it out. You had a question?
I just wanted to offer a little caveat. You negotiate on the offer, and you negotiate and do counter offers and rejections as well, but after it goes in a contract and you go back and they get the inspection, and then there's a repair list. There's gonna be more negotiating after that contract is ratified. So don't feel like after you get that contract ratified, because the repair list often goes through more negotiation than the price, the consideration on the offer to purchase. So just be aware of that in a real life scenario, that your negotiation doesn't start there. And I'm saying that because that's where I was. I was like, okay, it's a repair list, and okay, you're gonna do this. But no, the seller might not wanna do it, the seller might not have the money to do it, and it might determine whether the buyer wants to go forward with their due diligence. So you'll still do more negotiating after that on behalf of whoever your client is.
In other words, she's saying something like this: your job is beginning now.
Yes.
You're gonna be working really hard now.
Don't spend your commission check till it's in your hand.
And I used to say you don't get paid until it's not over until the fat lady sings,
That's right.
but now I don't say that anymore. Why y'all laughing? Don't you laugh at me. All righty, let me show you something on the board. Here's my illustration that I think will help you. Mutual agreement is a 3-step process. First of all, the offer has to come in, right? Guys, I really think this is going to help you. Mutual agreement, offer comes in first. Okay? Is the red hard to see, LaToya? Okay. I'm going to try to keep it high up if I can. I'll write this way. So the offer comes in first. Second, we know we present all offers, right? The second step is acceptance. And I want you to remember, it must be signed. Acceptance means signed. Now, maybe this happens, maybe it doesn't. If someone tells you, well, I'll tell you what a student told me in my last broker class we finished Friday. She said that she made an offer, because we were talking about this again. She said that she made an offer for a buyer, and she gets a call from the listing agent, and the listing agent said, we're all good. What does that mean?
You're on writing, send it back to me.
We're all good. And she was saying to the class, what does that mean? And we all said, you need to say, is it in writing? Now, probably the other agent meant the seller said they were going to sign it, but I can't get with them right now. I talked to them over the phone. Maybe they're out of town. They're coming back. They said they were going to take it. We're all good. You're not all good. Because what if another offer comes in? You have to present it. Even if the house is under contract, everybody, it must be presented. And what if the offer comes in and the seller says, well, I didn't know this was what those other people wanted, and I like this one better. I'm sorry. Even though we said it, we're taking this one. Verbal will not be the acceptance. It cannot be verbally accepted to get to the third step. I suspect that happens, but guys, if I got the call and the agent says, on the other end, the listing agent says, the seller has verbally accepted your offer, and we're going to get it signed today at 5. I'm going to say, call me when it's signed, or email me, or text me. I don't want to call the buyer yet. Because if you call the buyer, would you want to call the buyer and say they verbally accepted it? I don't think I would. I don't think I'd want to do it because buyers and sellers don't understand the business like we're supposed to. And if you say they verbally accepted it and then they don't sign it, now you've got somebody upset and they're gonna be upset at you, probably. Now, on one hand, it's almost like they ought to know everything going on, and so what do y'all think?
When to get on writing.
I would really want it in writing, wouldn't you? And pass it, and, you know, maybe touch base with the seller, the buyer, and just tell them, you know, we're waiting for the seller to sign it. Maybe you could say that. But until they do, we're still waiting, right? And just to keep them informed. But that verbal acceptance is not acceptance. It must be signed. Must be signed. Now, here's what's a little confusing. When we get to the third step, communicate, notify, communicate. When we notify to the other party that the offer has been accepted, that communication can be verbal. Now tell me if you understand that. The communication of the signing of the offer can be verbal. The acceptance cannot be verbal though. So if I call Jose and say the seller accepted your offer, and Jose's going to say, is it signed? That would be a good agent, wouldn't it? Have they signed it? And I say yes, and I'll forward it to you, or I'll drop it by your office today, or whatever. He doesn't have to have it in his hands to call the buyer and say, your offer has been accepted. Everybody with me? Because I told him it was, right? Now, we're not going to go off on, well, how do you know I told him the truth? We just can't go there. You know, I told him it was signed, and now let's backpedal for a minute. If he is a buyer's agent, when I call him and say it's signed, we are under contract right then. Does everybody understand? If he is a buyer's agent. Guys, this is test question, little wordy. Offer came in, offer was presented, seller signed it, call the agent. Agent tried to call the buyer couldn't be reached. Is it a contract? If he's a buyer agent, it is, whether he can reach the buyer or not. Is everybody sort of following? If it tells you that he works for the seller, even if he's in another company, and I'm going to show you this on the board, even if he works in another company, which would be co-broker, if he works for another company and the buyer says, I don't want you to represent me, he's going to call the list company and say, may I write this offer for your seller? May I be a seller sub-agent? You learned about sub-agency. And I'll remind you about that in a minute. If I call him then, he's not the buyer's agent. And that means the buyer is a customer. If I call him at 8 o'clock tonight and he's not a buyer's agent, here's probably something I would say. I would probably say, Jose, the offer has been accepted. The seller signed it. When you contact the buyer to communicate that we're that has been accepted, let me know so I can let the seller know when we went under contract. Is everybody with me? Because it's not a contract if the buyer is a customer until the buyer gets the word. Everybody good? So when you're reading your test question, first thing you got to know is who's who. And if they say Jose is working with the buyer, he's a customer. If it says Jose represents the buyer, the buyer's a client. Or if it says he's working for the buyer. Now, they could say he's a buyer's agent, but you know how test makers are. They might make you work for it because they're testing you to see, do you understand it? Guys, I understand from a student's point of view, this is a tricky question. Well, from an instructor point of view, they really want to know, do you understand it? And this is real life stuff, like Asher said. You've got to know this is level 3 real life stuff. And so learning a little bit here will help you when you get into the real estate business, you're gonna learn way more. I mean, this isn't your training, of course, but it's important that you understand this. So, comments or questions? All right, let me show you something. I'm gonna erase this. Who said no? No! All right. Let me see. No matter who has an agent and who doesn't, aren't the seller and buyer arm's length? They should be, shouldn't they? Arm's length. In other words, if a seller's selling a house to their relative, it might not be a true reflection of what the market's doing. But overall, doesn't the seller have an idea of what they want? And doesn't the buyer have an idea of what they want? Buyer wants the lowest terms best, seller wants the highest terms best, right? So they're on opposite sides. So I'm visualizing, and I would like for you to visualize, maybe this is a game, maybe this is a line in the sand, maybe this is a volleyball net, and we got a real game going. So I'm going to say, let's pretend it's a volleyball net, and we've got a volleyball game going on. So, now I'm going to show you a couple of different ways. The seller hired a listing firm. So the seller hired XYZ. The seller listed their house, they signed a listing agreement, and so let me remind you of that. We can review as we go through here. Go with me to, hold your place and go with me to page 192. This is the exclusive right to sell. Tyrell said this is the one we want as brokers because it says that we're entitled to our commission if we find the ready, willing, and able buyer, or if a ready, willing, and able buyer was found, no matter who found it, we're entitled to the commission. Look at the very first part. The exclusive right to sell listing agreement is entered into between the seller, and you would fill in their full name, and the listing firm. The firm is the seller's agent, everybody, not you, not me. Look at the rest of that little section. The individual agent who signs this agreement on behalf of the firm is the one who's responsible for communicating to you. They are the conduit, the representative, if you will. And they'll make sure that the firm's duties are fulfilled. Okay. Here's what I want to show you. The seller hired the firm. The firm hired, so I'm going to put some people here. Is it with an O? The firm hired Cameron. Everybody see? The firm also hired a whole bunch of people. Let's say all of us work for XYZ, or half of the classroom, let's say. Cameron works for XYZ, and he's an agent to XYZ. To XYZ. Let me do it this way. Okay, XYZ is the agent to the seller. Cameron is an agent to XYZ. So in your reading it said Cameron is an agent of an agent. Everybody with me? The only time you're called an agent, frankly, you're called we use that terminology, we're an agent, you're an agent to your company only, okay? That's the only time you're an agent. Cameron, because he works for XYZ, and XYZ was hired by the seller, Cameron is a seller sub. So Cameron is a seller sub-agent. He's a seller's sub-agent because he's an agent of the seller's agent. Let me give you an example. We are redoing our kitchen. We contacted a contractor, right? Hired the contractor. The contractor contracted with other contractors. There's a tile person, there's an electrician, there's a plumber. They're contractors on their own, right? So they're contracting with each other. Kind of like Cameron is contracting with XYZ. He's an agent, contractor to contractor. You're an independent contractor, aren't you? Those contractors that my contractor reached out to are subcontractors to me, not to the contractor. Because they're contractors on their own. Does that make sense? They're a plumber on their own. They're a contractor. There's a tile person on his own. He's a contractor. So they're contractor to contractor, but to me, they're a subcontractor. You are not a subcontractor to your firm. And that's what students want to say. You're not a sub-agent to your firm. Never, ever. You're a sub-agent to the client who hired your firm. You're an agent to an agent, making you a sub the second level down. Okay? Let's go to the buyer side. Let's visualize the buyer said, I do want to be a client. So let's find the buyer agency agreement. Everyone, it's on page 202. But I do want to say this agency and sub-agency is a little bit complicated, and you really need to make sure you understand the terminology. So on 202, I beg your pardon, if the person, Jose, we're going to use, if Jose says, I want to use this exclusive buyer agency agreement, look at the very first paragraph. Kind of says the same thing, doesn't it? The buyer is hiring the firm. The firm hired individual agents. The individual agents will look out for the buyer clients. The individual agents will look out for the seller clients. So, buyer hired ABC. ABC is an agent to the buyer. The buyer's a client. ABC hired Jose. Jose is an agent to his company. He's an independent contractor. He's working for ABC. ABC hired a lot of contractors to go out and get the job done. So Jose is an agent to ABC. Jose is a sub to the buyer. So an agent of an agent is a sub to the client. An agent to an agent is a sub to the client. Any questions on that? Okay, let me show you something else. If XYZ, let's say this half of the room works for XYZ, every one of you are agents to your company and sub to the seller. Everybody who works for XYZ is agent to XYZ and sub to the seller. So what that means is if you are on phone duty at your company, phone time, when you're there, if a cold call comes in to answer the question, you are a seller sub. And you're a seller sub because you work for an agent who got hired by the seller. So everybody in that company is a seller sub. It doesn't mean that we all will call the seller and say, you need to reduce your price or you need to clean up. The seller individual representative is Cameron. He's the one that went out and got the business and brought it back, and he's the one that will get part of the commission. Yes, ma'am?
Does that include the big and or the owner of the firm there?
Does what include?
The sub-agent part, I mean, she said if they're big, that they be
Would it be a sub-agent?
sub-agent.
Because they're working for Alan Tate or Al or whomever.
The big really stands in the shoes of the firm. So you could say the big could be the firm, the agent, like that. If the BIC is doing listing and selling, they'll be a sub-agent. But you're not gonna get that fine tune of a question. You need to know that the company, the BIC really represents the firm as if they are the firm. You know, so they're standing in the shoes of the firm, so you could say the BIC would be the firm in a way. Or, but that's a good question. Anybody else?
So to the seller, I'm sorry, to
Uh-huh.
the seller, as an agent, you're always a sub-agent.
You're all, if you work for the company
Right.
that the seller hired, you are always a sub-agent to the seller.
Thank you.
If you work for the company that the buyer hired, you're always a sub-agent to the buyer. You're a sub-agent to any client that hires your company. Think about working at any job. Think about Megan answering the phone. The students don't contract with her, but doesn't she have a responsibility to make sure she's taking care of my clients? Right? So everybody at this company has a responsibility to look out for all clients. It doesn't mean you're gonna step over Cameron's shoes. He went out and personally brought the business. But it means that if a buyer calls on this listing that's Cameron, you're looking out for Cameron's seller because it's really the company's seller. Does that make a little sense? Does it to you? Okay. I'm watching. Okay. All righty. Let's see what time it is. Let me just do one or two more things and then we'll take our break. So on the buyer side, it's a different company in this illustration, but it's the same thing. Everybody, this side of the room, everybody on this side of the room is an agent to ABC, making them a sub-agent to this buyer. Doesn't mean you're going to call the buyer and go show them houses. Doesn't mean that. But it means if that buyer were to call the company today and say, I can't find Jose and I just had this question. Well, then we are a sub-agent to them. You're not going to steal that buyer away, but if they just ask a question, you should be of service. Is everybody with me? Now, it doesn't mean you won't say the question could get involved, and you might say, it really will be better for you to talk to Jose. Let me try to reach him for you, if it's really an involved thing, because you don't want to step on his toes, right? All right. Everybody so far so good? So as we go through 9 and 10, we have to review agency because it's so important about when offers or contracts are created. Go ahead and take your break. We're at a good stopping point.